College football has gone through amazing changes in the past couple of years. College athletes can be paid now through NIL, name, image, and likeness contracts, and if the most recent NCAA lawsuit settlement is approved, universities might begin directly paying their athletes as early as 2025, something that seemed ridiculous just a couple years ago. It seems all but inevitable that at some point in the next 3 to 5 years, athletes will be ruled as employees and the college landscape will change yet again. There are a lot of people who feel that these changes will destroy college football. I have come to believe that they feel this way because of the idea of amateurism. The word amateur comes from the French word amateur, which is my best French cheesy accent, and that in turn comes from the Latin word for lover, amator, which is my best Latin, and the meaning of amateur being someone who participates in an activity but does not pursue it professionally. The concept of love is appropriate here, as we frequently look at our college athletes with our desire for them to do it for the love of the game. This isn't difficult to understand. I am a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I have a great fondness for the place because it is there that my experiences set me up to have a good career, lifelong career as an IT consultant. It's there I was free to be myself. I discovered a lot about myself and who I wanted to be in life. And I feel like that's pretty commonplace for people who love their alma maters. That time at university wasn't just all about beer, but you learned a lot, including who you were and where you were supposed to fit in life. We tend to project our feelings on others, including our athletes. The romanticism breaks apart when you are confronted with the idea your favorite athletes are just there to make a buck and may not care much about the place you love at all. Still, the idea of amateurism in college sports had to come from somewhere. And how did the sport of football get tied to colleges and universities in the first place? To begin this journey of discovery, we're going to go all the way back to Victorian England and the concept of muscular Christianity. I'm going to use the word football liberally here, applying football to what Americans call soccer, rugby, and our own college football of today. Around, say, the 1830s to 1850s, football had become popular, particularly in elite private schools in England. This is because it allowed the youth of the rich to avoid playing football with all of its violence with commoners. Not only that, it avoided something much more important, losing to commoners. It is at this time where the concept of muscular Christianity is born. From How Football Began, a Global History of How the World's Football Codes Were Born by Tony Collins, published in 2018. The ethos that underpinned Britain's elite schools was muscular Christianity, which placed vigorous and masculine physical activity at the center of its character-building outlook. At root, it was an expression of British nationalism, rendering the teachings of the Church of England into a credo that both justified and maintained the principles of the British Empire. Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby School from 1820 to 1841, had popularized a muscular Christian educational philosophy that sought to create healthy minds and healthy bodies, which, although he had personally no interest in sport, valued games as importantly as academic studies. Healthy minds were those seen as free of sin and moral weakness. It's not difficult to understand why the concept of muscular Christianity would be popular with the middle and upper classes in England. The fear was that life was getting too easy for them. Their bodies were getting weak. Lots of lower class people were building up strength. They were getting stronger. So basically, those in power, the upper and middle classes, wanted to make sure they stayed in power. To popularize an idea these days, we use marketing. Today, that comes in the form of social media, radio, television, the internet, whatever else. You know, we have so many forms of media with which to get the messages out. Sometimes it becomes too crowded for them to be heard. But back then, in the mid-1800s, there's no radio, there's no TV, there's no internet, but there are written words. Popularizing the concept of muscular Christianity came through a book, a novel called Tom Brown's School Days. It was written by Thomas Hughes, who attended the Rugby School. It was published in 1857. It showed his life as a young person who goes through the travails of bullying. It also showed football as a method of proving yourself to be a man and passing physical tests. It was a huge bestseller. It's a book that parents buy for boys that are going to be sent to boarding school. They want their boy to grow up and learn how to be a man. From Tony Collins. Tom Brown made football not only morally respectable, but also fashionable. It brought Rugby School and its version of football to a new national audience. So that's how football, or rugby, got associated with schools in the first place. It's sport, and it's building men morally. Then it's providing part of a moral education. Then you can justify it being part of learning and therefore school. Over time, this concept makes it to the United States. 1865, the American Civil War was over. The Reconstruction era in the South had begun. Then there's America's Wild West period. It's not very long. In fact, it's rather ironic and hilarious that the Wild West era of movies lasted longer than the actual Wild West era itself, which is around 1870 to maybe 1895 or 1900. It's in this period that America eradicates the Native Americans and conquers the West. Leaders like Teddy Roosevelt are concerned that America may become weak, that life may become too easy, much like those upper-class folks in England were worried about. When the concept of muscular Christianity and amateurism began in jolly old England, professional sports were looked down upon. Professional sports were the domain of those who didn't have the wealth and leisure time to participate in sports for sport's sake. That attitude was imported to the United States, particularly by a man named Casper Whitney. Whitney wrote for Harper's Weekly, a magazine founded in 1857 that focused on social and political issues. Note that Whitney's articles were influential in the 1890s, when college football was becoming popular and establishing its foundation. Whitney was a purist when it came to amateurism. From Harper's Weekly, October 3, 1896. What is an amateur? What is the incontrovertible distinction between an amateur and a professional wherever civilized man has his abode? Obviously, that one plays for sport and the other plays for gain. There are no degrees in amateurism. It makes no difference in the classification whether a man plays for $1 or for $100, whether he be the son of a millionaire or the son of a mechanic. It is the spirit that reveals his true status. It matters not whether he shoots pigeons, sails a yacht, runs a foot race, rides a horse race, plays football, golf, tennis, rackets, baseball, polo, or enters the pugilistic ring. If he accepts money as the reward of his winning, he is a professional. It is the character of the prize and not the character of the game that determines his status. Whitney saw the split between amateurism and professionalism as black and white. Not only did he not want college players paid, but he hated the idea of coaches being paid. Nor were athletes supposed to practice. He sees the split between amateurism and professionalism from a classist point of view. From an article in The Athletic by Jason Jenks on February 8, 2021, entitled The NCAA and the Myth of Amateurism, we find this passage about Whitney. So Whitney went to England in 1894, determined to bring the British brand of amateurism back to America. He watched golf at St. Andrews and rowing along the River Thames. Took in soccer at Oxford and fox hunts in the countryside. His takeaway was clear. Although professionalism had crept into some corners of British sport, he was reinvigorated by amateurism in the college ranks. At Cambridge and Oxford, he marveled at the almost indifference of the athletes and crowd, who seemed to find as much pleasure in afternoon tea as in the outcome. More than anything, though, the games were played by what Whitney called the refined elements of society. This, he believed, was the roadmap for American athletics. There was no reason, Whitney argued, for those refined elements to share the same fields as the low element and the great unwashed, Whitney's terms for the laboring class. He knew this was a direct contradiction with American ideas of democracy, but it was the only way. The modern Olympics started in 1896, and Whitney becomes a member of the International Olympic Committee and president of the American Olympic Committee from 1906 to 1910. The Olympics has been very strict about its amateurism throughout most of its modern history. Why? Supposedly because the ancient Greeks competed as amateurs, but even that has been exposed as a lie, as well as a further way to limit competition to those who could afford it. From the book Brief History of the Olympic Games by David C. Young. All but a few of our sports began in England in the second half of the 19th century. Victorian English society was strongly based on differences of social class. The wealthy property classes held a strong sway over the working class. They tended to regard themselves as aristocrats who would happily avoid physical labor, and they sought desperately to maintain their privileged position. As formal competitions in athletics began to spread in the 1860s, these upper classes invented the concept of amateurism, and the first rules, formed in the mid-1860s, were founded on a strict class distinction that had nothing to do with profit. Anyone who is a mechanic, artisan, or laborer was classified as a professional, ineligible to participate in the athletic meetings of the gentlemen amateurs who were springing up at the time. To bar a large segment of competitors increased the aristocrats' chances of winning. By the 1880s, however, pressure from the larger public forced a modification of the rules. Rules against any profit replaced the rule against the working class. The effect was nearly the same. The glory that was Greece had a special power over Victorian England, appearing as the previous high point in Western civilization. These men succeeded in legitimizing their elitist sport by citing a supposed precedent in ancient Greece. There, too, they claimed, only the upper social classes, aristocrats or nobles, competed in athletics. Although all other evidence had to be ignored, the partisans of amateurism could cite the policy of the ancient Olympics to award only a symbolic crown and no financial gain. Then there's another organization that's birthed around this time frame. On December 28, 1905, in New York, 62 colleges and universities got together and started the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States, which is the precursor to the NCAA. The NCAA's history claims Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for the organization's birth, which is pretty stretchy, as it was New York University Chancellor Henry M. McCracken who actually brought everyone together to figure out how to save football, which at that time was going through an existential crisis due to the amount of deaths that were occurring in the game. Now, there were problems with football at the time. Schools were hiring what were known as tramp athletes, players who didn't attend college but were paid to play football. There was clearly a need for regulations regarding eligibility. The players needed to actually be students, otherwise the football is part of education philosophy doesn't work. And something else interesting happened along the way. Colleges and universities early on began to find that sports, particularly football, was worth a fair amount of money. From John Sayles Watterson's College Football History Spectacle Controversy about the 1893 Yale-Harvard game. The big game had become big business for both of the schools. In 1893, Harvard spent $18,754 on football, including $3,226 for transportation, $1,887 on summer practice, and $33,469 for the training table. Their custom-tailored leather uniforms cost $125 apiece. In turn, Harvard's total receipts reached a record of $32,092, $15,409 of it from the Yale game alone. In addition to the profits from the Princeton game in New York, Yale could gross as much as $20,000. For comparison, this ad from 1890 shows I could buy a size 42 suit for the sale price of just under $15, regularly $35. And according to an online inflation calculator, $20,000 in 1893 would be around $700,000 today. Now keep in mind that stadiums weren't huge, transportation was difficult, and this certainly didn't include radio or TV revenue because they hadn't been invented yet. Bottom line, from around 1890 to the 1920s, the popularity of sports explodes. You have a religious reason for participating in sports. Education has decided sports should be part of their activities. And you have two of the most prominent sports organizations in history pushing amateurism. Imagine had things been different. Imagine if someone years ago would have had the clout to say, the hell with all this professionalism, we should share revenue with the athletes. It would have been a radical idea. In the early 1900s, there was barely a concept of professional college sports. There were barely a concept of professional coaches. However, there was an example of sharing profits with players back in the day. From the Real All-Americans by Sally Jenkins about Pop Warner at the Carlisle Indian School, talking about sharing profits from football. Some of the profits went to the players too. Warner was silent on that tricky subject at the end of 1907, but he had indeed paid his players. As the Indians became such a huge box office draw, it only seemed right to give them a small cut. Mostly players received small amounts of $10 and $15 at a time, but some of them had received loans or larger cash bonuses. Exendine, for one, received $200 in that year. Albert Exendine was one of Carlisle's best players at that time. Arthur Martin, Warner's secretary, observed, yes, the boys felt they'd earned it, so Pop turned it over to them. Warner would end this practice at the end of 1908 because he feared charges of professionalism. So instead, amateurism lived on. The NCAA set rules for eligibility and, of course, invents the concept of the student athlete in the 1950s, specifically so athletes would not be declared employees and thus subject to workplace rules and workmen's compensation claims. Again, imagine if the NCAA would have gone the way of Pop Warner and began sharing revenue with their college athletes all those years ago. Imagine all of the scandals that wouldn't have been scandals. Decades of scandals, over a century of scandals, a huge percentage of which all dealt with the illegal benefits of some sort or another. Jim Harbaugh wouldn't have had to lie about buying hamburgers. Jim Tressel wouldn't have gotten in trouble for covering up discounted tattoos. Barry Switzer might have won 20 national titles. Perhaps coaches' salaries wouldn't have escalated through the roof, as well as Taj Mahal facilities building. Would athletes have made enough money to be full-time football players? No, that wouldn't have happened for many, many years. Even in 1925, when Red Grange helped establish a fledgling NFL, he had to have a full-time job to sustain him, and that would be true for NFL football players all the way into the 1970s. But the possibilities of what might have happened are endless, and might make for an incredibly fun discussion. Does knowing that amateurism was pushed and popularized by the upper class so they wouldn't have to lose to riffraff like you and me make you feel any different about today's college football changes? Let me know in the comments section. I'm John Johnston, and this is Hardcore College Football History. Thank you.